Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us at this regional forum, Catalyzing Innovation and Partnerships to Build Local Disaster Resilience in Caribbean Communities. I am Nicole Lioto, Canari's Executive Director, and the Caribbean Natural Resources. Canary is very pleased to be hosting this virtual forum and welcoming you to it today. I am joined by my Canary colleagues, Candice Reynolds and Dr. Anka Granderson, who will be assisting with the webinar and presenting. You'll hear from them later. And this virtual forum is being held under the CSOs for Disaster Resilience project. It's running 2019 to 2022. And it's being implemented by Canary in partnership with other organizations in Antigua and Barbuda, the Commonwealth of Dominica and Grenada. And you'll get to meet them soon with support from the Inter-American Foundation. You'll hear more on the project in the first session. Next slide, please, Aaron or Candice. So the objectives of the event really are about knowledge sharing on our experiences and priorities in the Caribbean, on how we can best support at-risk communities to build their disaster resilience using community-based and ecosystem-based approaches. And in particular, what we want to focus on is the role of civil society in building community resilience in partnership, of course, with the public and private sector. We're also using this opportunity to introduce and launch the Regional Community Resilience Action Learning Group. And you'll hear more about this at the end of the session this morning. And this is really a peer learning group that will further dialogue on community resilience in the Caribbean, facilitate peer learning and exchange on how we can best work together to promote and build capacity for community-based and ecosystem-based disaster resilience in our Caribbean islands. Next slide, please. Let me just go over the agenda briefly. So after this very brief welcome from me, our guest presentation will be from SEDIMA on the hurricane season 2020. Of course, we are now entering this season, so it's a very timely presentation. And then we have a number of experts, practitioners, people, a diverse group of panelists who are going to share their perspectives on how can we catalyze, support, and empower Caribbean civil society and communities to build their resilience. So that will be just under an hour panel discussion. And then we really want to have a good 45 minutes with you interacting on the question and answer session. And of course, we'll introduce the technology on how you can submit your questions and get involved. So we have a nice discussion with our panelists. Then Candice is going to briefly introduce the Regional Community Resilience Action Learning Group, and we'll have closing and end by 12 noon, Eastern Caribbean time, of course. I don't know where we have people from. Thank you. So next slide, please. Let me introduce our wonderful panelists and our speaker and thank them so much for taking the time to join us this morning. So first we have Dr. Nicole Greenidge from SEDIMA, who will give the guest presentation. And our panelists are from the OECS Commission, Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel, from the IFRC, Cecile Marissa Clark-Marshall, Erica Hill from one of our partner civil society organizations and partners on this project, the Environmental Awareness Group, which is based in Antigua. Mr. Glenroy Toussaint from the Local Government Commissioner, the Local Government Division in Dominica. Welcome, Mr. Toussaint, thank you. And Lisa Perch, an independent consultant with expertise in gender and working specifically on gender and climate, gender and disaster, gender and environmental management. So thanks to all of them for joining us. And we're really looking forward to a very rich discussion with this diverse group of experts, bringing many different perspectives to the table. We also would like to welcome and acknowledge you. The registration showed we have diverse participants from civil society, national and local government, private sector, academia, and regional agencies involved in disaster risk reduction and management, climate change, environmental management, community development, and sustainable livelihoods in the Eastern Caribbean and the wider Caribbean region. So really, we have a very rich group of participants, and we hope to get your perspectives in the Q&A session later. And in particular, of course, welcome the wonderful partners we have on the CSOs for Disaster Resilience project. And our 6 civil society partners are the Environmental Awareness Group, as well as the Barbuda Fisherfolk Association, which are from Antigua and Barbuda. We have 2 CSOs from Dominica, Wild Dominique, as well as the Ans Canary Tourism Association. And from Grenada, we have the Grenada Education and Development Program, or GRENED, as well as the Leo Club of St. Andrew. And in addition to them, I know we have online participants, other CSOs working at the national and local level, Red Cross societies, and so on. And a special thanks, of course, to the regional agencies that are joining us and others. We're really happy to have all of you join us this morning for what we think will be a very interesting knowledge sharing session as we launch the hurricane season. It's all, of course, very foremost in our minds, the importance of community resilience. So I would like to welcome you, and we will be able to quickly move on to our first session. Our guest speaker, Dr. Nicole Greenidge. Can you show the next slide, please, Candice? I can just introduce Nicole, another Nicole. Hi, Nicole. And Nicole is joining us from SEDIMA, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency. So, of course, the CARICOM organization with responsibility for community resilience and also integrating climate change. So Nicole brings a wealth of experience playing various roles across the region, as you see in her bio, really looking both at disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And I really appreciate Nicole bringing both experience as a researcher as well as practitioner, and she's held various roles around the Caribbean. And I think she's going to bring that that experience and that passion to the talk. And really, I welcome you, Nicole. Thank you very much for taking the time to share with us. And please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Nicole to Nicole, and appreciate the introduction. Good morning to everyone. And I want to say thank you to CANARI and to its team and partners for inviting SEDIMA to this very important regional forum. So at this time, I'm going to share my screen. I hope everyone can see our screen. So as Nicole has already introduced who SEDIMA is, these are the participating states of SEDIMA. And today I will be speaking on the topic Hurricane Season 2020 Lessons and Plans for Addressing Community Risk and Resilience. So I'll just say just 2 more pointers on SEDIMA, other than what Nicole has already mentioned. I'll speak about the 2020 hurricane season, lessons and plans as it relates to community risk and resilience, some take-home messages, and some recommendations for our consideration. So, as has been mentioned, we are the regional intergovernmental agency responsible for disaster management in CARICOM. And these are the 5 main functions of SEDIMA as it is outlined in the agreement establishing SEDIMA, and particularly just homing in on the pointer on mitigating consequences of disasters and the other function of encouraging disaster loss reduction and cooperative arrangements and mechanisms. I mean, mostly, you know, it's easier to see the mobilization of coordinating of disaster relief at the moment. SEDIMA is involved in the logistics for COVID-19 moving, personal protective equipment, and so on. But as it relates to today's session, this very much aligns with our work in mitigating consequences of disaster and encouraging loss reduction. Our member states, stretching from all the way from Suriname all the way up to the northern states of the Bahamas. SEDIMA is the broker for comprehensive disaster management, and that is the management of all hazards through all phases of the disaster management cycle by all people, the involvement of the public, the private sector, civil society, yes, and the general population. It involves risk reduction and management and integration of vulnerability assessment into development planning processes. In this regard, strategically, we have coordinated for our Caribbean region the Comprehensive Disaster Management Strategy for 2014 to 2024. A strategic approach to comprehensive disaster management is something that SEDIMA has been pushing in the region for some time now, and this is the most up-to-date strategy. It has 4 overarching priority areas: institutional strengthening, knowledge management, sector integration, and community resilience. That's priority area number 4. So the strategy gives us overall blueprint and direction. It's informed by very wide consultation, and cooperation is necessary for the implementation of such a far-reaching strategy, which has the overarching goal of safer, more resilient, and sustainable Caribbean states. I want to draw our attention then to priority area number 4, which covers 4 main areas: standards for safe communities being developed, community-based capacity being strengthened, community early warning systems being integrated, and community livelihoods safeguarded. So let's get right into it then. Having that context and the strategies within which SEDIMA is working for our region, we were asked to talk on the 2020 hurricane season, and it has been identified as being it will be a very active season. Named storms ranging from 13 to 19, Colorado State saying we can have up to 16, and up to 8 to 10 hurricanes, and major hurricanes up to 6 according to NOAA, and up to 4 according to Colorado State. The named hurricanes, the hurricanes for 2020 named 1 through 21, and as you note, we are at already number 7, Gonzalo. So in case you may have missed it, this is just the update for this morning. We have Gonzalo in our region as at 8 o'clock this morning. It was located near latitude 9.8 north. It's moving toward the west near 12 miles per hour, and it's moving in a general westward direction. So here's the cone where Gonzalo is expected to affect. And it is quite important to note that Barbados is on a hurricane watch, as well as St. Vincent and the Grenadines. This tropical storm is expected to become a hurricane later today, and it's expected to start affecting us between Friday and Saturday. Hurricane conditions in Barbados from Saturday, and you can go to the website of for your meteorological service organization, and you will see the information that as it relates to your country, we want to promote that. We also pull our information from the National Hurricane Center. It's expected to produce quite a bit of rain, and in case you may be wondering, or you may already know, a hurricane watch means that you will expect hurricane conditions within 48 hours. So we are already seeing Gonzalo. It is making history in terms of its formation, but we all have been living with COVID. And one pointer I wanted to hold on to take away from the presentation too is that hurricanes can occur simultaneously, and there can also be secondary hazards. So, I mean, hurricane season, we're still dealing with COVID-19. And if we understand too how the hurricane hazard operates, it's categorized by the strength of the winds, but also it comes often with quite a bit of rainfall. And if we look back at the experience of Maria and other hurricane impacts, you know, that can be accompanied by landslides or even storm surge. So as we talk, I want us to be thinking multi-hazard, a more comprehensive understanding, because this is the reality within which we live, as well as one of uncertainty. You know, who would have thought COVID, you know, 2020 would have come this way? Some people say they want to reset 2020. So if we're living with uncertainty and we want to move out of where we're reacting, we want to be more proactive, we want to be sustainable, we want to be regenerative, then we need to be thinking about resilience. And resilience, I mean, it has a number of definitions, but I want us to take home from this one, the definition where we're talking about your ability to cope, your ability to bounce forward in a way that will reduce your susceptibility to impact of the same hazard. For example, UNDRR, they promote also build back better. You want to be better off as a result of having been affected. And true resilience in the Caribbean will require transformation. It's not a business as usual, but essentially involves challenging the existing status quo, including the systems and the power relationships which cause the accumulation of vulnerability and which must be included and changed if root causes are to be addressed and societies are to be transformed. So very quickly then, what are some of the lessons that we have learned for addressing community risk and vulnerability? Well, one of the key, we've talked about a strategic approach, the comprehensive disaster management. I mean, before 2007, yes, we would have had this strategy where it outlines this is a pathway that we want to follow as a region. But then what 2007 threw up for us as a result of that is that we needed, as a Caribbean, to have a pathway for building resilience. And this pathway was presented at the CARICOM heads of government. They asked for it prior in the 29th intercessional meeting because the region, you know, because of the impacts we've been having all the time, the losses, the impacts on livelihoods. And so SEDIMA, with support of its partners, developed this Caribbean pathway for building resilience, and that was adopted in 2018. The pathway, as you can see here, it has 5 pillars, social protection being number 1 for marginal and most vulnerable, enhancing economic opportunities, safeguarding our infrastructure, environmental protection, and operational readiness. The other enabling environment is identified here in this diagram, but I just want to point out the emphasis on pillar 1, which is social protection for the marginal and the most vulnerable. And this is one of the key lessons that we took away, that we really need to give attention to this aspect of our resilience and how that is understood. And so we broke out then, we were, as a region, be able to say, well, we need well-designed social protection systems. We need policies and programs which will assist individuals and families with coping with crisis and shocks. Yes, in the region, we do have some kind of social protection schemes to some degree, but it was felt that these really needed to be built out. They need to be flexible. They need to be responsive. These are some of the areas where things needed to be improved: disability benefits, the pensions, the livelihood protection schemes, subsidized home insurance, low interest loans for home retrofitting, psychosocial support systems, empowerment programs for those living with mental illness. And so these systems need to be cognizant of the realities that we're facing, and to be able to provide the necessary cushion for social assistance. So let's think a bit on COVID-19, because I mean, I have been working in our regional response mechanism, and in my role as information management on that, in that system that is operated by the region. And as I go through the situation reports from that we have to update, we see that, you know, for COVID-19, some governments were reactive, you know, because they didn't have those social protection, you know, they didn't have those kinds of networks or schemes in place before. Others are finding themselves to be quite constrained at this point in terms of being able to sustain the systems that they have in place. Some don't have the necessary policies to keep them going. And then the fact is that everything is interconnected. How will these things be financed if tourism is out of business? How will we have the income to keep it going? So social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable is critical, and we need to consider it within a multi-hazard context. In 2009, John Twigg, he put together what is called the disaster resilient characteristics of a disaster resilient community. Some of you may be already familiar with it. What we've done is taken that and said, well, what would this look like for the Caribbean? And this was prior to 2007, when we had such devastation from Maria and so forth. Here, we have 2017, sorry, stand corrected. The governance mechanisms are quite important. Risk assessment, so you see governance here. I'm not going to call out everything that's on the slide. The risk assessments, having the knowledge and the education, the training, these are critical aspects of our characteristics of a resilient community. Risk management and vulnerability reduction. And as part of that kind of approach would involve environmental management. Again, you see the interconnectedness. We can't separate disaster risk reduction from how we adapt to climate change or how we manage our environment. These are all interconnected in the broader picture of sustainable development. Social protection being critical, physical protection as well. And then the capacity, disaster preparedness and response capacity, the early warning systems at the community level, the contingency planning, the volunteer groups being active and working. So this gives us delves a bit deeper then into how we can understand community resilience. And so what SEDIMA has done is develop a draft community resilience framework that builds upon this characteristics of a disaster resilient community, along with other works. And we realized then that having done that, having seen what what came out of the heads and the importance of that pillar on social protection, these are our plans for addressing community risk and resilience. So these are now aligned according to the standards, and for the standards for community-based disaster management within to that priority area 4 of the CDM overarching strategy. So we want to advance the community resilience framework. We have plans to review and update that to also address COVID-19, the lessons from this pandemic, the newest thinking on community resilience. From the capacity side, as it relates to having information to inform what we do, we're working on a community risk information system to increase the disaster information that will be available there. Also a Caribbean risk information system, and then we have this Caribbean community risk information tool. We want to enhance this tool that we have sought to develop, and it's a tool that seeks to identify and rank vulnerable communities for targeted action. And also then reviving the CDM Comprehensive Disaster Management Civil Society Sector Subcommittee for Coordinated Action on Building Community Resilience. This is, so we can have harmonized action. I'm really glad that we could be in this forum because I know a lot is happening, but there is a space to really come together within this broader governance mechanism for how the region goes forward on comprehensive disaster management as it relates to community resilience. The early warning systems bit, we are expanding out what we've done so far. We have this checklist for multi-hazard early warning systems. And then out of that, countries develop a roadmap, and then there's funding to address priority gaps. And this is being advanced under some funds that we have under the EDF project at SEDIMA. And then as it relates to livelihoods, this very, very important element, programs and incentives that will minimize the medium, small, micro enterprises, the impacts on those. We see how COVID has played out there. Research to roll out the most feasible and innovative options to address impacts, and then also to increase the national capacity for recovery, so that as we look at where we've fallen short and we realize that social protection has been a gap, we are working with partners such as the World Food Programme on this aspect about how we can enhance the social protection. And then we're looking to build out different interventions for this. First, we are doing some research to understand what those could look like. So in summary, take-home messages and recommendations. We would encourage you to support the implementation of Pillar 1 of a resilient Caribbean, social protection for the marginal and most vulnerable, as well as priority area 4 of the comprehensive disaster management strategy and framework that focuses on resilient communities. Also adopting a more coordinated, multi-hazard, comprehensive disaster management approach to how we address community risk and resilience. We have some frameworks and so on that I would have shared with you there for consideration. And then to leverage the social protection programs and policy frameworks for all levels of human vulnerability, recognizing the reality of the shocks and ensuring that there's no discrimination. The remainder of the recommendations that are here come straight from the Caribbean Pathway for Resilience. And so those include strengthening our poverty alleviation programs to ensure that the vulnerable are resistant. This is what would have been presented to our heads of government. Improving equitable access to financing to support livelihood restoration. Revisiting cash transfer and mechanisms to ensure the implementation will focus on stimulating the local economy. All of this is still relevant, and this was done before COVID-19 would have impacted us. And establishing social protection support schemes for those who wish to build safely. So this is on the physical resilience aspect. So I just want to thank everyone for listening. And I hope that there may have been some useful pointers for you to take forward as we also discuss as a panel, what can be done for building community resilience to risks faced in the region. So I just leave with you the website for SEDIMA and my email address, and I'm happy to take questions at the appropriate time. Thank you. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Nicole, Dr. Greenwich. This is Candice Reynolds. I'm a technical officer at the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute. And I will actually be jumping in now just to share a bit more and give you an overview of the CSOs for Disaster Resilience Project, and to say that we will be able to accommodate the questions for Dr. Greenwich during our panel discussion and the interactive question and answer session. So let me share my screen. So basically, I would just give a brief overview of the project and to say that this is the project under which we have organized this virtual forum. And so we are very happy to have all of you join us for this forum and also to hear a bit about what work we will be doing under this project. So I wanted to start by briefly introducing CANARI for those who may not know, and to say that we've been working in the region for about 30 years, facilitating stakeholder participation in stewardship of natural resources in the Caribbean. We do a research, facilitate participatory processes, as well as develop innovative approaches, awareness, capacity, and conduct advocacy to support on-the-ground actions by civil society and rural communities. Canary has been working in the region for quite some time, and what we wanted to highlight here is the work that we've been doing on nature-based and community-based solutions to build climate and disaster resilience. And so our goal really in doing this work is to improve resilience of communities, livelihoods, and ecosystems in the Caribbean to climate change and disasters. So in terms of the CSOs for Disaster Resilience project, what I would like to highlight, and already stated, is that this project is a 3-year project which we are implementing with the support of the Inter-American Foundation, and we have partnered with 6 CSOs in 3 target countries, Dominica, Grenada, and Antigua and Barbuda, to implement this project. So the 6 CSOs that we've actually partnered with in Dominica, Wild Dominique and the Canary Tourism Association. We've also partnered with Grenada and the Leo Club of St. Andrew in Grenada, and the Environmental Awareness Group and the Barbuda Fisherfolk Association in Antigua and Barbuda. And so the goal of the project really is about, we've recognized the need for more effective engagement of local communities and civil society organizations in disaster reduction and building resilience. And so the focus is targeting or engaging these at-risk communities in decision-making, conservation, on sustainable management and restoration of natural ecosystems to reduce disaster risk and help people and systems adapt. So the need that we've seen is that, of course, we have all been, experiencing, and we have seen the significant hurricane impacts in the Caribbean. And so that, especially in the particular countries that we have been targeting for this project, Grenada, Antigua and Barbuda, and Dominica have seen significant impacts themselves. And so this is a core area where we feel that we need to continue to work and to build on. And definitely more focus is needed on building resilience of local communities. And we're making the connection with building resilience of their livelihoods and ecosystems, as a way to reduce impacts and to help them adapt. And the focus as well is to ensure that there's consideration of natural solutions and engaging at-risk communities, which is where we are looking at this as a part of a broader strategy for building resilience. So in terms of the project components, I would just like to highlight the 3 major components which are really in line with the objectives of the project. And the first one really has to do with strengthening CSOs or civil society organizations to deliver community-based and ecosystem-based DRR. And this involves obviously both technical and organizational strengthening and capacity building. The second component looks at supporting practical DRR actions and involves in conducting participatory vulnerability assessments and action planning, as well as supporting the civil society organizations that we're working with to design and implement practical action projects with target communities. The third component, and this is quite cross-cutting, has to do with knowledge mobilization and partnerships. So we'll be looking at what sort of initiatives that are happening across the region and trying to build relationships and synergies, facilitating dialogue as we are doing here today in terms of local community resilience in the Caribbean context, and engaging in action learning, as we'll talk a bit more about later. And part of this whole process is to continue to share results, lessons, best practices, and innovations as we go along. So just to touch very briefly on the whole, you know, the area that we are focusing on in nature-based solutions and integrating nature-based solutions into disaster risk reduction strategies. I just wanted to mention that, you know, we view EcoDRR, or ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, as conservation, sustainable management, and restoration of natural ecosystems to disaster risk, and to help people and systems adapt to climate change and build resilience. And we view community-based DRR as actions designed and implemented in partnership with at-risk stakeholders in communities. And that aspect is really important to ensure that we promote appropriate and sustainable solutions in terms of addressing disasters and climate change. And as you see in the graphic there, these two nature-based solutions and community-based solutions there, it's important to have that integration and that linkage. And that acknowledges that managing ecosystems well also contributes to, you know, empowering local communities and reducing their vulnerability. And so, why use nature-based solutions? We have quite a few examples of nature-based solutions that have been used or are being used already in the Caribbean, and they involve a number of different types of ecosystems. So you may be familiar with, you know, coastal habitat restoration. You may heard about mangrove restoration, coral reef rehabilitation, practicing sustainable fishing, agroforestry, and so on. And these are just some examples of what, you know, are the types of ecosystem-based approaches that could be used. And as I said, these have been used in the Caribbean. They're based on existing tools for ecosystem-based management. Generally, they're found to be less costly and resource intensive. And, you know, they provide core benefits as ecosystems. Also, as ecosystems also serve as carbon sinks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is just to give a general sense that, you know, nature-based solutions could be used as part of this overall strategy for building resilience along with other strategies. Okay, and I will end my brief presentation there, and I will join you a bit later as we talk about the Action Learning Group. But now I would like to pass you over to my colleague, Dr. Ainka Granderson.
Okay, morning everybody. Hope everyone's hearing me well. Welcome once again, and thanks to Candice and to Dr. Greenwich for starting off us with very insightful presentations, particularly the presentation on hurricane season 2020, which I think really sets the stage for our panel discussion, where we'll delve deeper into how we can catalyze, support, and empower Caribbean civil society and communities to build their resilience to hurricanes and other extreme events alongside government and the private sector. We have 5 leading experts who will share key perspectives in relation to this question in 10-minute presentations, and then this will be followed by Q&A and interactive discussion as noted on the agenda. If you have any questions for the presenters, please post in the chat, and Candice and I will note these to address in the interactive discussion and Q&A at the end. So I would like to invite our first panelist, Mr. Chamberlain Emmanuel, Head of the Environmental Sustainability Division at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, OECS Commission, who oversees a wide portfolio of programs and projects, including on climate change and disaster resilience, and has over 20 years of experience in leading work in this area, as well as having served as St. Lucia's chair of the National Damage and Needs Assessment Committee from 2008 to 2019. He will be presenting on building community resilience in light of the wider goal to have a resilient Eastern Caribbean region.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. And let me say thank you to Nicole and the team at Canary for inviting OECS to be part of this initiative. Very much commendable and aligning with our own work. So, as indicated, I will be essentially presenting on our perspective and work dealing with building community resilience in the OECS. And also would like to commend the presenters before, and as we resonate fully with especially what SEDIMA has presented before me. Just to give you just a brief overview in terms of the priorities of the OECS through the Environmental Sustainability Division. We are guided essentially by the St. George's Declaration of Principles for Environmental Sustainability, and we are essentially about launching the new version of it, which is captioned SGD 2040, Environmental Agenda for the Eastern Caribbean. And you could see here essentially the key priorities, which include the area of climate and disaster resilience in the top middle here, essentially ensuring that the risks and vulnerabilities that we face are addressed adequately at all levels. And we have the enabling actions. So these are the areas in which we act. These are the approaches we take towards dealing with those priorities. And I will come back to one of them in particular later down in the presentation. Okay, but before, I just would really like to tell you a story. And the first part of the story is, as we see here, that in the islands of the Caribbean and some of the other states, we really have a story of what we've captioned as cyclical retardation. And I'm sure if you live in the region, you've experienced this. You know exactly what we're speaking about. We go through being impacted by those disasters. We try our best to recover, and while we are still in the process, we are hit again, and it seems to be occurring, in a never-ending cycle. And I always like to refer to this quote from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the 5th report, which says that climate could be one of the causes why some countries are trapped in poverty, and climate change may make it harder to escape poverty. And I want us to think of poverty, not just at the macro level, speaking about GDP, but really, right down to the common man in the communities. And so the economic development and social welfare of small islands, developing states, are more severely impacted by natural disasters compared to larger nations. And disaster risks posed by natural and technological hazards, if not effectively addressed, could result in disasters of such magnitude as to reverse the development process of the OECS member states. Another story, as indicated in the introduction, I would have served many years as St. Lucia's chair of the Damage and Needs Assessment Committee. And this are pictures from 2010. We went to the NEMO office and never made it back home because we had to bunker down. And the next day, these are the pictures that were captured. And these pictures in particular all tell one particular story, that of the communication infrastructure being severed. In other words, communities were stranded. Soufrière in particular, remember when we took that helicopter flight and we came around and just saw a large scar on the mountainside. And that was the Columbet Hill had collapsed and Soufrière was not accessible. And the bridge that you can see in the top right-hand corner at PI in Labrie, which would take you to Soufrière from the south, was also cut off. And so, and this was a story in many other areas of the island, you know, and this is where I think it really practically brings to for the critical importance of having capacity in communities. When the national and regional capacities is not yet or unable to mobilize for various reasons, in those immediate few hours where lives can be lost or saved and needs can be met, you need to have communities that are strong and have capacity. And so at the OECS, we have really focused a lot on this area in terms of disaster resilience, in terms of building capacity for community resilience. And I will just excuse the small print, but this is really the definition from the SGD 2040 of capacity development. It says, capacity development is the process through which individuals, organizations, and societies obtain, strengthen, and maintain the capabilities to set and achieve their individual and collective development objectives. Components of capacity include skills, systems, structures, processes, values, resources, and powers that together confer a range of capabilities. It can occur at the level of the individual, the organization, communities, sectors, ecosystems, and the enabling environment. And again, refers to several tools as indicated here. So with that, based on the work we've done, and at the close, I will essentially just show you some photos of some of that work. But what the lessons we have learned here on the right-hand side include, you know, really seeing ownership. It's one thing for, you know, a government ministry or a large agency to go in and do everything for the people. But when you involve them and they are the ones at the forefront, then you really see ownership actually. Capacity building, we've seen that where organizations which, you know, really not sure what they're doing, if you work with them and be patient with them, then you can really help them grow. Sustainability, because they've owned it and they've done it themselves, you know, you don't always have to go back in to patch up and fix. You know, they really take ownership of it. And so sustainability is more guaranteed. We have seen livelihoods supported across many of the islands that we've worked, and that includes livelihoods for women, okay? And it actually is, in many cases, more cost effective. You take away the middleman and you know, and the large profit margin that goes to that agency, and you get communities to do more for the budget that is provided to them. And it's an opportunity to incorporate local and indigenous knowledge, including nature-based solutions. And so we have been promoting several approaches and tools for years. Even before my time, we have the B tool, the vulnerability benchmarking tool, which is a process for helping communities to identify the vulnerabilities, come up with interventions, and to implement and to monitor. We up to very recently, and I see Lisa is one of our panelists here, herself and others leading on this. We have developed the Building Resilience with Nature and Gender in the Eastern Caribbean, a toolkit for mainstreaming ecosystem-based adaptation and gender equality and social inclusion in the way we address those hazards and adaptation in communities. And so just to flash a few photos here, we really are grateful for our partners who have bought into the concept and have been very consistent and very faithful. CRIF, SPC, the government of New Zealand, and most recently, government of Germany through the GIZ have been our financial partners and technical assistants in this regard, where we've done from works in terms of mitigation against flooding, rehabilitation of mangroves, rehabilitation of disaster shelters. We've also seen here, top left-hand corner, it looks a little strange, but it's actually one of the outputs of one of the intervention was helping to reestablish a fuel station for one of our fisheries groups in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We've done training in proposal writing. Many times that capacity is lacking, and able to assist and to guide those community groups in that capacity. And we have the youth and women involved, and the men also taking ownership and participating in those processes. We are very glad for the tremendous involvement of the younger generation, okay? And so that again helps to strengthen the sustainability. So it's not just the adults who are acting now, but we're creating the culture and the capacity at the lower level, so that this capacity does not go away when persons leave the scene. So that essentially is the little story I wanted to share. And I also want to acknowledge Josette Charlemagne, who is on the call, and she would be able to use our focal point for this initiative. And because I would have to leave a little early, she would be most capable to take questions and share more details as we proceed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chamberlain. That was very thought-provoking. Next up, we have Ms. Cecily Marissa Clark-Marshall, Coordinator of the Red Cross Caribbean Disaster Risk Management, CADREAM Cell of Excellence at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, IFRC. She has worked at the IFRC since 2013 in the areas of resilience, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. And she'll be presenting on their ongoing work across the region to build community resilience, including lessons learned, best practices, and innovations. Take it away, Marissa.
Okay, am I being heard? Hi, good day, everyone. I'm just trying to put my screen on slideshow. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Canary, for once again including the Red Cross, the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, as well as its national societies. I am actually going to share this presentation this morning with my colleague from Antigua and Barbuda. She is the Director General of the Antigua and Barbuda Red Cross, Lorena Benjamin, and so we would be doing this presentation together. So the presentations before were very exciting and energizing for me, because it shows that the region is certainly as far as the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement is concerned, is moving in the right track. And we do have very similar activities. And I think it would augur well for very rich panel discussion, because the one concern I would have is that there are many very similar activities going on, and at the same time, and it would be great to find out in terms of how we measure successes and how we measure if what we are doing is actually working. So the international, just a bit about our organization. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies is the world's largest humanitarian organization, and we are present with through our national societies in 192 countries, and in the region, and certainly from the Caribbean region, where I work, which is a country cluster support office for the English-speaking and Dutch-speaking Caribbean. We cover 13 countries, 13 actual participating states of SEDIMA. We cover from in the north, Belize, and down to Suriname, so 3 continental countries, including Guyana, Suriname, and Belize, and 10 small islands, or 10 islands, including Jamaica, down to Trinidad and Tobago. And the Red Cross has been in the region and working in the areas of climate change, community-based disaster risk reduction, community-based health and first aid. We've been working obviously the national societies are well known for their strength in volunteering. We have over 14,000 volunteers within the region. And we are also well known for and very active in community-based activities. One unique feature of Red Cross and Red Crescent National Societies, and in the case of the Caribbean Red Cross National Societies, is that we have an auxiliary role to our government authorities, and that's usually part of every Red Cross National Societies Act. So interestingly, in terms of the definitions of community resilience, it's based, and I heard Dr. Greenidge speak to SEDIMA's definition. This is the definition, working definition that we have in the Red Cross. And interestingly, when we talk about the ability of communities and their members exposed to disasters, crisis, and enduring underlying vulnerabilities to anticipate, prepare for, reduce the impact of, cope with, and recover from the effects of shocks and stresses without compromising their long-term prospects. And I liked when Dr. Greenidge talked about bounce forward, because we've moved from wanting to get back to where we were, and that once there is a shock or a stress, we would want to ensure that communities are well equipped to build back better and safer. And so we have from a global perspective, and here I'm presenting our strategy 2030. Now, we are at the cusp of launch of this strategy being implemented. It's already launched, and this will be done in, of course, January 2021. Our strategy identifies 3 main goals, and these goals are basically where the Red Cross has realized that, and again I heard Mr. Chamberlain from the OECS say that communities, in order for communities to foster resilience or become more resilient, it has to be that the communities are involved in their own story. So our 3 major goals: people anticipate, respond to quickly recover from crises, people lead safe and healthy and dignified lives, and people are mobilized and inclusive. We have realized that at this time, and especially more so with the events of 2020 and the COVID-19 situation, that it's important to know that resilience is and how we define resilience. It's not one specific component, and this also came out in the SEDIMA's discussions, as well as the discussions before the presentation. But I want to also point out in this slide to the transformations, because we talk about our national societies are autonomous, they support their communities, but for them to be able to do that, it's important that they have the capacity. And so our 7 transformations actually focus on supporting our national societies to be effective and strong local actors, so building their capacity. And this might link well to civil society organizations. And I saw from the last presentation where the focus would have been on capacity building initiatives such as proposal writing, etc. Since COVID-19 has affected and has hit the region, our national societies have been forced to be innovative and creative in the terms of, and in the way, in the terms of ensuring that they become more or remain and ensure that they're more relevant, to their communities. And so they have been engaging in many areas that or areas that they would not necessarily have been part of their work plan. And so our strategic vision for promoting resilience is to develop holistic strategies that put people first, and coherent plans that will usher transformation, strengthen the role of local actors, and promote collective efforts collective effort, and also to concentrate and to understand that we are, while we support communities and all levels of communities, it's the support of the low-income and the highly vulnerable communities, especially, as we say, the last mile communities. This slide is very interesting because during COVID-19, the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement realized more than ever the need to adjust and adapt. And we had taking place through our Solferino Academy, where we invited cartoonists, well-renowned cartoonists, to basically present their work that reflects our work and what we felt and what our challenges would be. So, this slide speaks to that. Multiple needs require a holistic strategy and much more flexible financing mechanisms, because as we very well know, one of the major issues that we would have in the region is a lack of funding. The lack of funding, we tend to get funding when there's a crisis, but the lack of funding for developmental work. And we also realize in the Red Cross that COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 is significant and will continue to be significant in terms of how we achieve resilience. And so that when we continue, all our programs and our projects will need to ensure that we have a COVID-19 lens. If we have to really respond and recover to what has happened. Our priorities with respect to COVID-19 again, capacity building for our national societies, the fact that we have some the socioeconomic challenges that will face the communities where our national societies serve, and the health impacts. So that's something that this slide speaks to that. Okay, I'm sorry about that. On my very fancy, but just to show that we talk about COVID-19 has sort of exacerbated and shown the type of vulnerabilities that our communities deal with. And so the aim, as we said, is when we are rebuilding, is to rebuild better and safer, right? So the key actions that we have taken in the region, well, not in the region only, but from a global perspective, is that we realized that we needed to have some sort of methodology for achieving community resilience where we could measure our success. And therefore, in about 2017, just prior to 2017, maybe 2 years before that, around 2015, the IFRC worked with national societies and other partners to develop the IFRC's framework for resilience. 2 years after that, in 2017, and triggered by the Sendai framework, triggered by the World Forum for Community Resilience, the IFRC, and just internally, the need to provide guidance on our national societies to operate and operationalize this framework. The IFRC came up with a flagship tool. And I must say at this point, it's that we are actually in the process of reviewing it based on the last 3 years. But the first thing we decided to do, and I saw that in SEDIMA, this was also done, and this was also based on previous work of trying to characterize what a resilience community means, that we identify 6 characteristics of a resilient community. But then we realized over the last few years that we also have to ensure, so besides the characteristics, there are many dimensions to these characteristics. And like every presentation before, we speak to a resilient community being healthy, being socially cohesive, being is exposed to economic opportunities, critical infrastructure, well-serviced and well-maintained, and the management of natural assets. Now, I know we are a humanitarian organization, and it may seem strange to persons that climate change and the climate crisis does not mean much, but if you understand the climate crisis and how it affects our vulnerable people, and the most vulnerable, including migrants, then you'd understand why, as an organization, we have to continue to be relevant. And so on my right, you will see like a roadmap, and that roadmap is what we have also developed in terms of a methodology for actually supporting our communities through engaging and connecting. One important aspect of that is to have their communities understand what their risks are, their vulnerabilities are, and what their capacities are to be able to address these risks. So understanding community risk and resilience, and then taking action for that resilience. In Grenada, the Grenada Red Cross worked with the Nature Conservancy a few years ago and continued to work with them. But that project at the water's edge developed a community resilience action plan. And that action plan served as a resource mobilization strategy. The communities own that action plan, and they've used it to be able to collaborate and connect with the partners, prospective donors to support their community development. And very, very important, and like the project that this forum is under, the need to learn all the lessons learned from what we've done. And so our approach is people-centered, holistic, demand-driven. We accompany communities, we enable communities, and we connect. We allow communities to connect with as I said before, partners that can support their development. I am going to stop here because I know we have 10 minutes, and I'm going to invite Ms. Benjamin to discuss what the Antigua and Barbuda Red Cross has been doing in their communities in terms of supporting their communities to build resilience. Loretta?
Good morning, everyone. Hi. Okay, so here at the Antigua and Barbuda Red Cross, we pride ourselves on being one of the organizations that are, very in touch with our community. It's, to me, one of the most important elements that make the Antigua and Barbuda Red Cross poised as a community-based organization is because we have links to the community. In terms of our volunteers in particular, we have volunteers all over the island. We have persons who are in the organization who are able to effect responses outside of the organization in their communities. I am just trying to up our shared screen. Here it is. So this is a bit more academic in its approach, but it encapsulates a lot of the concepts that we have spoken about before, especially in terms of Candice and Chamberlain. They really would be putting out what it means to have a resilient community and some of the different challenges that we face as community-based organizations and tackling resilience. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to save us all the academia. Can I have another slide, please? Right. And go into more of what's actually happening on the ground. So the Antigua and Barbuda Red Cross has been working in communities in terms of resilience. So one of the major elements that I would say is a part of our resilience is readiness. I think that is the primary, maybe I am biased because I am Red Cross and that's one of the things that we are for, but I think one of the most important elements of our resilience as communities is having knowledge and people and processes pre-positioned for response to whatever the shocks are. And so when you have community-based organizations, you're reaching into the communities, you're reaching into the lives of the people who are going to be most affected by whatever that shock is. And you're preparing them to respond to whatever that shock is, enabling them to be more resilient because they are prepared. So for example, we have the early warning system project that was executed in partnership with, it's funded by UNDP. And that's one of the more recent, it finished recently, I think it finished in April. And it focused on working with vulnerable communities in Grace Farm and the south of the island, which are Erlings and Old Road, where persons were taught about early warning systems, what they do, how to better prepare themselves for natural hazards that may come their way, especially as coastal communities. For the southern ones, Erlings and Old Road, what happens if there's storm surge, what happens if, in case of hurricanes. So what we did, we went out into the communities and we would have conducted edutainment exercises in terms of showing videos, showing movies, showing people what the effects of natural disasters are, showing them how they could be more prepared, also helping to show them how they, through their daily actions and their engagement as a community, could reduce risk For example, how cleaning up their communities, making sure the drains were clean, making sure that they were practicing particular habits could help them reduce their openness to being flooded. Flood prevention mechanisms, and also training individuals at the community level to respond to disaster, and providing them with some of the tools in the forms of things like CDIT bags to respond to disasters. So from that, we can see that community-based organizations are a linchpin of the disaster response process. And if we scale it higher, of the resilience, the overall resilience. So one of the things that thank you, Candice. One of the things that makes the CBO special is we're light on our feet. We have a ripple effect of being able to do something small. It goes out to the wider community, and we can spring into response. Some of the concerns, or some of the things that I think we should consider for lessons learned and going forward, is how do we build stronger CBOs? How do we build stronger community-based organizations? Some of those things are fostering a climate where civil society is active. Different communities and different countries have different civil society contexts. The framework in which we're responding in, the level of support and the level of buy-in, and how open people are, and how influential the civil society organizations are. For example, I'm so thrilled to see one of my colleagues, Awika Hill, on this panel, because she has a very influential civil society organization in the form of AAG that she's the head of. So making sure that this institutional development, like Candice said, to have civil society organizations that are poised to respond in terms of making sure the capacity is built, in terms of making sure they have adequate level of knowledge, not adequate amounts of tools, and adequate amounts of funding to build these organizations to be able to respond and be resilient. Because in the end, the center of our process is the people. The tools, the money, the frameworks, all of those things are about centering people to be more resilient and able to respond. So that multi-level stakeholder, the donors, the communities, the government, and all the other individuals that we have around us are part of the processes that will help us have more community-based organizations that are more resilient and able to do more work in our communities. So I'm going to, as we are over time, that is the summary version of the presentation.
Thank you, Loretta, and thanks to Marissa for that very practical perspective, linking work on disasters, climate change, and other key risks like COVID-19. That was very interesting, and I think it segues very nicely into our next panelist, who's Miss Erica Hill, Executive Director of the Environmental Awareness Group, EAG, based in Antigua and Barbuda. She's been working in the environmental field for more than a decade with a focus on conservation, sustainable resource management, and environmental education, and recently championed the plastic bag ban in Antigua and Barbuda. As we noted earlier, EAG is also a partner on the CSOs for Disaster Resilience Project, and will be working closely with Canary and other partners over the next 2.5 years to implement activities under this project. Today, she will be looking at the role of civil society and communities and nature-based solutions in building local disaster resilience. The floor is yours, Erica. Hi, Erica, we can't hear you. I don't know if you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. Good morning, everyone, again, and just saying thank you to Canary for inviting the environmental awareness group to be a part of this discussion. And thank you to the presenters before. It's been quite interesting. So this morning, I want to talk about the work that the Environmental Awareness Group has been doing. We are based in Antigua, and we are the longest standing environmental group, non-governmental organization in Antigua. We've been around since 1988. And I'm just going to give you just a bit of an overview of what we do. So essentially, the work that we have done in two of our priority areas, which is the Northeast Marine Management Area and Redonda, has been in building ecosystem resilience through offshore island rehabilitation. And our form of rehabilitation has come in the form of removing invasive alien species so that those islands are stronger and they're able to kind of live normally. So in those instances, we've removed rats, we've removed goats, we've removed mongooses, and that has allowed those islands to really regenerate. And in the case of the NEMA, we have been able to rescue the critically endangered Antigua and Marissa, moving those animals from being critically endangered with only 50 individuals to well over 1,200 in 25 years. In the case of Redonda, in the form of 3 years, we've been able to see that by removing rats and removing goats, we've been able to see that island get 8.4-fold increase in endangered, well, not endangered, but they are endangered, endemic reptiles, as well as seeing that our plant species and vegetation cover has significantly increased. And this is probably is a huge thing for a small island, especially because of the time period in which it happened. 3 years is an extremely short time. So this is one of our great accomplishments. Now, because of the work that we've done, it has also allowed for increased tourism activity within the Northeast Marine Management Area. And that is significant because, as we know, over 60% of Antigua's GDP is dependent upon tourism. So being able to increase the beauty of an area allows for more persons to enter the tourism industry and enter it in such a way that they are not negatively impacting the natural environment, but rather enjoying it and sharing that with others. We've also been able to increase the appreciation for ecosystems in Antigua and Barbuda through some of our flagship activities, one of them being the floating classroom, which has been taking really thousands of children out into the natural environment, on boats, out to offshore islands, so that they can experience the wonder of nature. They can experience the wonder of seeing birds flocking all around them and being able to identify them, possibly seeing an Antiguan racer in the wild, and for some of them, actually going on a boat for the first time, seeing upside down jellyfish in mangroves. And that has been a part of, really has been because of partnerships with local community, partnerships with local tour operators, partnerships with the government, regional institutions, and international institutions as well. And so in general, we believe that we've also been able to increase engagement with coastal communities because it at least gives us an immediate in when you're able to say that, hey, we've been here, we've seen you. We've been working with fishermen who help us to take us out to the islands so that we can make sure that there are no more rats and no more goats and no more mongooses. So there has been that great collaboration over the past 25 to 30 years. Now I wanted to show this picture because it's important to see what building that resilience really looks like. On the picture on your left, which is this one, this is Great Bird Island in 1995 when we began work on this island to save the critically endangered Antiguan racer. And this island was riddled with rats and mongooses And you can see that it's a bit patchy, and the vegetation is not that great. On the right, you see a stark difference. This picture was taken at the same time of year, same kinds of environmental conditions, and this is following at least 20 years of work where we have removed those rats and mongooses, and you're seeing that the island has rejuvenated completely. And this is the work that is necessary for rebuilding islands and rebuilding offshore islands. Now, how have we been able to do that? How have we been able to garner that kind of support? Now, I think the greatest thing that EAG has been able to do is being able to maintain a core number of volunteers who do critical ecosystem and species work through really practical hands-on approach. Now, these people have been doing work on conducting snake censuses every year. They do bird surveys. They check on, they've been doing thermal monitoring, bird surveys, and biosecurity monitoring. Now, biosecurity means that they verify that there are no more rats or mongooses, and that is hard work. That we've also been able to do consistent training and development for these volunteers. So we have cross-training opportunities between ourselves and another CSO, which is the Angola National Trust, where either they come over to do training on how we do censuses on our snakes, or we go over to them to kind of get a refresher on how we manage rats and mongooses on our island. And of course, we also offer I'm sorry, I realized that there was a bit of a problem with my mic, so I'm just a bit closer now. We've also been able to work with persons who do thermal monitoring to do in water monitoring, which also helps to increase their ability and increase their appreciation and their skill set for thermal monitoring in general. Finally, we also make sure that we offer recognition, great recognition for our volunteers. And that's national recognition in the form of sharing information on our social media, as well as on our weekly EAG Talk articles in the newspaper, as well as nominating them for awards. So very recently, this young lady, Andrea, was given a Woman of Wadadli Award in Environment. This gentleman, Tahamdi Smith, has been recognized as a Disney conservation hero, and we continue to do that kind of work and encouraging people to recognize that we have local people who are doing phenomenal things. So the question is, can those skills be transferred for supporting communities to build resilience to disasters? Of course, the answer is yes. And how we see that happening under this particular project is we hope to do some work with the parent community who there has been some developments, some tourism development in that area very recently that has removed large swathes of mangroves, and that has been quite a sore point for us as environmentalists and for the community, because we do recognize that the removal of a mangrove ecosystem is going to reduce the resilience to this hurricane season in particular. Now, we have then said, okay, maybe we can do a mangrove restoration or reforestation project. And what's interesting about that is that they have done this before. In following Hurricane Louis in 1995, some of the community members actually went out and did some reforestation of mangroves. And so we want to see if we can do something like that again, work with them to identify the best spots for reforestation. We also want to recognize that we can do some skills development, and the project that Canary has developed involves doing a vulnerability assessment, and we want to make sure that when we're doing that work, it doesn't sit with the EAG alone, because yes, we've been around for ages, but we are not the only beneficiaries of something like that. We want to make sure that the community is involved and that they are the ones who can identify how can we identify the best spots for building resilience in the community, and they are the ones who are going to be the person involved in doing it. And then finally, of course, the importance is to recognize communities. It's very easy to just do the work and kind of move on, but it's important to make sure that they are recognized consistently through social media campaigns, through television, through traditional media forms. Making sure that they are centered is very important to us. And we also believe that we can do skills transfer. So where the farm has done the mangrove restoration and it works, can we then move to other communities and do that kind of work? However, what we need to know is what do we need to catalyze that support and empower those CSOs and communities? And we recognize that there's support that is needed for us. While EAG is good at maintaining relationships, we do also know that because we are a 9-to-5 organization and community work is 5 to 9, that we have to find ways to really be able to do that work alongside them. We also want to create a culture within communities of EVA, instead of it just being a one-off that only lasts the life of this project. We want to ensure that the work that we're doing is a part of the culture of Param, a part of the culture of the communities that we work with, so that it doesn't die. Finally, we also want to be able to identify and support sustainable livelihoods. What are some of the livelihoods that are already being supported by ecosystem-based adaptation, and how can we strengthen those ties? And then, of course, there will be the technical support in vulnerability assessment and mangrove regeneration. And finally, why are we hopeful? We are extremely hopeful. We're extremely excited about this project because we believe that we can redefine culture. In recent days, people have been speaking a lot about our tangible cultural heritage. And we kind of look at our stories and looking at stories that are very old, but we want to be able to say, okay, this is the legacy that we are creating so that our children and our children's children can look back at the time that we made sure that we ensured that our future was secure. So thank you, and please make sure to follow EAG Antigua on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Erica, for that very practical and interesting presentation, highlighting the importance of community-based and nature-based solutions in building resilience. Without further ado, I wanted to introduce our next panelist, Mr. Glenroy Toussaint, who is the local government commissioner in Dominica, who works in close collaboration with the Climate Resilience Execution Agency for Dominica, CREAM, and the Ministry of Planning, and has over 30 years experience in the disaster field. As a local commissioner, he works very closely with communities and community-based organizations, and is also chairman of the Shelter Subcommittee of the National Emergency Planning Organization in Dominica. So he will be presenting and sharing key lessons from Hurricane Maria and perspectives on achieving Dominica's goal to be a climate resilient nation and priority actions to build community resilience.
Thank you very much, and let me say a very pleasant morning to everyone. And I just want in advance to say that please forgive me if I'm excited because of the fact that today is my birthday. And so I'm happy to be here. First of all, thank the organizers for having me to be part of this regional experience as far as resilience at the from a community development standpoint and community resilience in that regard. I must say I have been working with communities my entire working life, so I'm pretty familiar with how communities work and a community's expectations and how they work in partnership and collectively in achieving the desired goal. So interestingly, I will seem to put some focus really on our approach as Dominica's approach in terms of building resilience following the ravages of Hurricane Maria in 2017. Okay, let's move on. Next slide, please. In looking at the vulnerabilities of communities, it's important that we understand the context of Dominica. We're really rugged in terrain. It's really mountainous, as everyone should know. And so with that rugged terrain, it means, therefore, you have a lot of valleys. They say Dominica's valleys, hills, and mountains. And certainly that in itself poses its own challenge. And one of the major challenges that we have is the whole question of land slippage and landslides. In fact, we do not necessarily have to be in a season, in the hurricane season, to get rain so that landslides occur. That, in fact, a recent survey was done, and in fact, that is one of our major hazards in Dominica is land slippage because of our topography. And so if you get, for example, in any given time, 3 to 4 inches of rain, there will most likely be a landslide in one of our communities in Dominica. Of course, we are dubbed in Dominica as the land of many rivers. And so those rivers and valleys and streams have now become hazards by themselves. And so we have been impacted tremendously as far as floods are concerned as it relates to our rivers. In fact, if you talk to anyone in Dominica, they will see a river differently because those rivers have in fact impacted the lives of many people, in fact have in many respects taken lives. As recent as Maria in 2017, and even before Maria, Erica in 2015. So certainly, what rivers are now seen in Dominica as a nuisance, not in that regard. And the whole issue of coastal settlement, in fact, more than 90% of our population in Dominica is along the coast. And so those communities are exposed to sea surge and as a result of sea level rise. And so we have a number of homes and communities being impacted by the sea when we have adverse events such as storms and hurricanes. So these are the vulnerabilities that are experienced in Dominica by our communities. Next slide, please. And so considering all of those vulnerabilities that I mentioned, it is critical that we please focus and consider some critical issues. I put some points for consideration. We all know of the devastating effect of Hurricane Maria, and I think one of the panelists before me did indicate that and show the slides of the impact of hurricanes and storms in the Eastern Caribbean, and of course Dominica featured heavily. And in fact, in Dominica 2017 Maria, 226% of GDP was impacted. In fact, totally wiped out the country. And so we have to consider in that context the economy of communities, the economy of the country. A number of our communities are really agricultural based. And so with the impact of a storm or hurricane, you know what the devastation to the agriculture in those communities. The physical environment, we have seen a transformation since Maria for our ecosystem as a result of the impact of Maria. Social assets, social capital, the whole quest of people in communities, how they relate, is important. And very important too, we learned those experiences from Maria and even Erica, the importance of stakeholder and civil society in building that resilience at the community level. That is critical. Another very critical area is the question of the structure of our communities. What exists, how well they are structured. We seem to have a number of elements in our communities, but are they well structured so as to meet the resilience at the community level that we are talking about? And the question of community empowerment. Are we empowering communities in terms of resilience planning? Are we ensuring that they're advocates for change of vulnerable groups in our communities? So these are very critical points that need to be considered in the whole quest of talking of resilience at the community level. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, I spoke earlier of the whole the whole issue of resilience. I just started to give this graphic so that you understand clearly. We're talking of the economic resilience. I mentioned it, the economic resilience in terms of how do we position our communities, how do we position the country in terms of health, in terms of education, in terms of agriculture, in terms of fisheries, and that sort of thing. How do we position the economy in terms of environment? How do we protect the environment, the marine life, the ecosystems? And of course, social resilience of our people. How do we ensure that there is sort of social cohesion in our communities? And importantly, how do we examine the whole issue of community resilience at the community level? So these are just a graphics of putting it into perspective. Next slide, please. Let's look quickly. I'm just going to go very quickly at this one. The whole challenges that are facing communities and in some respects civil societies in building resilience. Communities, many of them are not so fortunate in our context in Dominica to have the technical expertise and technical expertise in a different front in terms of the resilience approach that we're talking of. The whole issue of resource limitations. I mean, if Dominica, for example, with the extent of damage that Dominica suffered as a result of Maria, that seems significantly impacted the resources available to communities and the country by and large in the recovery process. The question of limited capital for investment that I in fact mentioned, he did that issue. Regulatory issues critical in that regard as well. And the issue of resources may be available, but there are some situations where in some communities that builds back to, in terms of capacity, they may be available, but in communities they have ability to attract such resources. Sorry about that. Sorry about that, folks. I experienced some technical difficulties.
Hi, Glenroy. Maybe turning off your video and just doing audio might be okay if your Wi-Fi is not working that well.
Okay, well, all right, we seem to be having some difficulty, but let me just proceed while it's up to give the I'm not sure if I'm working if it's on. I'm not
Yeah,
sure. So please.
Glenroy, I think just continue with audio and don't do video because video takes up more bandwidth.
Okay, excellent. Oh, okay, that's fine. Thank you. All right. Okay, excellent. So can I get the slide with regards to our experience or lessons from Maria? We can skip this slide. Yeah. Excellent. Thanks. All right. So based on the experience of Hurricane Maria, we realized clearly that some communities were cut off from central emergency responders. And importantly, that was a situation where they were unable to cope with their most basic needs, resulting in physical and mental stress that could be avoided. And so some of the lessons that we learned is the question of food storage. I mean, there was a critical issue in terms of the provision of foods for communities, for the survival, the issue of shelter management, and we link that to resilient housing, water storage, issue of communication. Some communities, as I said, were cut off for days, and very little communication was coming from those communities. And that created a major challenge for us. The whole issue of medical supplies, alternative sources of power. I mean, many communities were without power for many, many months. In fact, there were communities that only got power maybe a year after, sometime in 2018, late in 2018, so to speak. And the whole issue of the strengthened community structures. Importantly, mentioning all of those challenges and the lessons that we've learned from Maria is that Dominica set itself on a path to becoming a resilient country. And in that regard, two very important documents were presented. One was the National Resilience Development Strategy, Dominica 2050, and coming out of that really is a Dominica Climate Resilience and Recovery Plan, and that plan should take us to 2030. So it's a Dominica Climate Resilient Recovery Plan 2020 to 2030, and that in fact set itself a platform for, as I said, making Dominica a resilient nation. And so to help in that process, a parliament creature, a creature of parliament was created, what we refer to as the Climate Resilient Execution Agency of Dominica, CRED. And that agency is really responsible for spearheading the efforts in ensuring that the plan that had been developed, the Dominica Climate Resilience Recovery Plan, is in fact executed. And one of the important pillars in this whole plan is the issue of strong communities. And one issue of strong communities is the ability for communities to cope and to manage and to handle adverse events such as hurricanes and storms and even
Canary, I think he may have
the Community Emergency Readiness Initiative. Essentially, that initiative
sorry, Glenroy, I think you're dropping in and out because of your Wi-Fi. Can I ask you to quickly wrap up if you can get back on? Otherwise, I will move to the final speaker because we're running out of time.
Yeah, so we've been working with the CRED, as we call it, the agency that I mentioned, in executing that initiative. And essentially, first of all, we had to what we refer to as do an assessment, a community assessment, and we sort of rank communities in terms of most vulnerable, least vulnerable, and what we've done thus far is that we've worked with them in terms of, one, to begin the process of building capacity and setting the structure, the strengthening of what we call disaster management committees, community-based disaster management committees. We have set the platform in ensuring that we strengthen those structures. So that is one of the activities that we've started in terms of strengthening those structures at a community level, working with all stakeholders in the community. Everyone is involved in that process. And the next level is to basically look at the environment. So we do an assessment of the community environment and how, in terms of doing what we call a hazard mapping, so to speak, of the environment itself. We have first looked at the 10 most vulnerable communities because we believe those communities were most impacted during both Erica in 2015 and Maria in 2017. And so we are working with those first 10 communities. The intention really is to work with all communities island-wide, but essentially, initially, we're working with those 10 communities. And the process continued. Of course, we were slowed down really by COVID from March up till somewhere towards the end of June. We were sort of slowed down, and so we have continued the process from July, sometime the second half of July. We've continued that process, and we are looking forward to continuing that engagement with communities, because ultimately we want every community in Dominica to position in such a way that they will respond to their needs even before central response can come in. I think in short, because in the interest of time, I think that is essentially where we want to go. But in closing, I want us to look at an approach as we speak of community resilience, an approach where we can, for example, even stemming from the series, as we call it, of an approach where we can have that sort of a community-based resilient organization, so to speak, I want to call it. And so they can propel that activities and programs in the community. It can be a collective effort involving, all stakeholders within the communities, because we believe that approach will certainly help and enhance our efforts in building resilience at the community level. I think that is where I want to take it now, because in the interest of time as well, I hope I was able to impact some information and knowledge that can be shared on any questions that would do our efforts. I'll be willing to answer. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Toussaint, for that very insightful presentation on Dominica's experience, and also happy birthday.
Thank you.
So yeah, so without much ado, I'll move to the final fifth speaker. Last but not least, we have Ms. Lisa Perch, who is an independent consultant specializing in gender and environment and based out of Barbados. She's worked in government and international organizations, including the UN, throughout her 20-plus year career. And she will be presenting on engendering local resilience and addressing gender and other social inequities.
Good morning, everyone. I wish to thank CANARI and its partners for the opportunity to share with you this morning. I also want to thank the other panelists for their presentations, and I'm happy to say that I think that my presentation captures elements across all of those. Happy coincidence. And also thank you, the participants. I know we're running short on time and the amount of time we wanted to have for the Q&A, so I am going to try to review some of the elements of my presentation and try to pick up on some of the things that I think cross-sect with some of the other presentations we've had. So my focus this morning is on engendering local resilience. My thought, though, is a little bit different from those of other presenters, because I also would like to encourage you to think of communities as not just geographical or physical entities, but also communities of need, particularly when you're looking at persons or industries or sectors that face multiple vulnerabilities and challenges, and how we tackle a community resilience approach in that way. This is quite important, I think, particularly for our region, where things are never that far apart, things are often intersected, and things also have knock-on effects on other things as well. So, you talk about, what's happening in the household often has an impact on also what's happening at the community level, and also to think about how we can really make sure that when we look at resilience, we're taking the broadest and most holistic approach. Next slide, please. So when I thought of this presentation, I thought of what I could contribute. I thought it was important to make the point that there is a gender inequality of risk, even in a region that is has progressed as much as ours. We still face challenges, and we see those challenges manifesting often when we face crisis. We have to admit that the nature of crisis is also changing. So while we have often thought about hurricanes or tsunamis or earthquakes, we're now in a COVID context, and we're realizing that we are now moving from what may be seen as situational risk to everyday risk. And so before we spend a lot of our time focused on how we would address extensive and intensive risk, a lot of that generated by climate and environmental change, but some of that is shifting also into everyday risks that are linking in with other vulnerabilities and other challenges that we have, particularly at a social and economic level. And those risks and challenges are not only gendered in nature sometimes, but they're also, gender plays a big influence in terms of the type of impact and the extent of that impact and how long it takes a person, a household, or even a sector or a part of a sector to recover. And so it's important, I think, this framework that was developed by UN Women to think about it, not just the element of the event itself, but also the interconnections and the knock-on effects that happen in a circular way on the lives of persons that we're trying to help, the most vulnerable. If we're really intending not to leave anyone behind, it's also important to recognize that the risk does not end because the extreme event or the change has muted, has reduced. The risks continue. And we see, for example, when we look at some of the impacts we've seen over the years, whether it's Grenada, Ivan in 2004, or more recently Dominica, where there are some very specific risks and challenges and insecurities that face persons within our community. Women and girls in shelters, for example, every time we do an assessment, we find some evidence, anecdotal or otherwise, of sexual harassment and other issues, whether it's, grooming, behavior as well, whether it's linked to people being left alone or unsupervised, or it's the reality of putting a lot of people into a small space with, limited capacity and perhaps not enough thought to what happens in terms of physical security. We also have to think about, when we see looting happening in the community post-crisis, what is driving that? And sometimes if you talk to some of the persons, what's driving it is a need for men and boys to do something and to take care of their families. And how would we also deal with those risks that come and change the context of the risks that are happening after a trauma has already occurred? We also have to think about COVID-19 and what working from home has meant for quite a few people, what it may mean in the short and medium term, and what that means for care work, particularly for women, for elderly members of society, what it means in terms of who takes care of the children. If we continue to have children out of school, that changes also the context even of how one does do work during the day. And so these are issues and challenges that we'll be facing, and they're part also of when we think about resilience. There's physical resilience, yes, but there's also a critical element of social and economic resilience that we need to think about in terms of also a person being able to earn enough to take care of their family needs. And then we also have to remember that our events don't just impact people, they impact the environment. And so when you look at some of the impact reports that we see, you see impacts on water, you see impacts on energy. Those have very intense impacts and create risk also for persons who have to go and collect the water, who need water, not just for productive uses, but for reproductive uses and for sanitation and hygiene. We also see the extent of some of those impacts and what that means also for the social, economic, and environmental use of water. Water is not just for us. The environment itself also needs water to be able to produce food, to be able to feed animals, to be able to create, for us to harness the biodiversity that we have. So I wanted to start there in terms of thinking about what we mean by resilience and taking a slightly broader approach to that. Next slide. It's also important to think about those groups I mentioned and thinking about who are we talking about? And so I also shared this slide coming from some work that I did for UNDP in 2018 for the Engender project, which is very much focused on gender responsive resilience and recovery, and looking at what you yourselves, the community out there, is saying. And you think the needs are, whether it's looking at who's lacking the knowledge and capacity and opportunities to respond or to adjust, or who is most at risk and who is unable to cope. I think that when you look at our own thinking about our experiences and where we see things, we see very clearly that there are sectoral communities, there are communities themselves, and then there are also elements of the community that are gendered. If you look at the second graph, you will notice that the furthest to the right in terms of least able to cope are what do we call male-only households. And we use that term speaking largely and generally to not just gender, but age. A group of men who tend to live alone, who tend to have very limited social capital. And often when you've done the community work and looked at who's being abused potentially, whose food is being stolen, whose houses are definitely not as well taken care of, who have nobody checking for them, it's often this group of people. And so when we think about also our resilience, we need to think about those gendered and social drivers that also shape what vulnerability and the inability to cope look like. This work I thought was quite insightful in terms of how the community of actors such as yourself really thought and saw the issues. We also see the need to look at persons with disabilities. We need to look at persons living with HIV, particularly think about their health needs in the context of any crisis. Anything that limits our ability to move or our mobility is going to be important for those who need to access medicines and who have very specific health needs. That's another community we need to think about as well. Next slide, please. And we are looking at these issues and we are seeking to respond. So if I look at this example from, again, Dominique and Maria, I looked at what was most recent. You look at some direct action to kind of start to take a gendered and a social approach to building resilience and responding and smoothing some of the challenges that households and individuals are facing. You see this example from an emergency cash transfer initiative that was implemented by UNICEF and the World Food Program. And you can see they put some thought into it in terms of looking at both men and women, but also looking at the specific groups that I've mentioned and highlighted in the last slide. This kind of work is very important to make sure that we look at the intersectional nature of vulnerability and building resilience, and not just one element or the other. It's all of the package. Nobody lives in an environmental box, only, or a social box only, or an economic box only. And we need to make sure that as we do our work, we do it in a way that really captures and responds to those. And of course, it's not always only negative. Sometimes there are positive in some of the dependencies and interdependencies that we have. But if we don't explore those, we don't also understand how to make sure that we can enhance those and support and enable those positive drivers also of adaptation. Next slide, please. It's also important, I think, given what we're seeing now, particularly in COVID-19 and what we've seen over the last few years in the context of climate extremes or slow onset and sudden onset events, to begin to think about moving beyond the household and the individual. And so I think this welcome focus by Canary and others on the community is really an important step towards doing that. And I say this because of some work that I'm currently doing and some of the work that we did for the OECS that Chamberlain mentioned. When we have to look at how persons' dependencies or involvement in certain activities also make them, put them in either a fragile situation or a precarious one. And it's important to look at that, not just because of the individual and their involvement in fisheries, but it's important to look at where they're involved in a fisheries food chain, for example, or value chain. So if you look at the persons involved in processing, and you look at what that means in terms of the amount of pay they receive, the lack of assets they usually have, they don't usually have the boats. If you think about their ability to cope and adapt and to turn on a dime should something happen, all of those things drive how people themselves perceive of their capacity, their agency, in other words, to be able to adapt. Their ability to even ask for help sometimes is shaped by whether this is really an issue or this is an acute issue, or whether their needs perhaps may be less or perceived as less than others, even though they may be feeling intense pressure. It's also important to think about seasonality of income, even when you work in a sector or an industry, what that means in terms of income dips and gaps, and also the fact that you have limited access to finance and to emergency support. Informality and informal work prohibits a lot of people from being able to access formal mechanisms of public support. So we need to think of those elements as well, and how our social protection mechanisms also consider those who are working in informal work or partially informal work, or perhaps are in multiple forms of work. So they have no one specific profession or source of livelihood. And I don't think we've done enough work on that as yet. Next slide, please. I'm keeping an eye on the time. And so as I think about this and as we do our gender work, next slide, please, we need to also think about the specific needs of some groups. And here I use very specifically a focus on women because this was the nature of the work that I was doing at the time, and how that helps to also open up the window to other issues that other groups may be facing. And to recognize that often when we do our work as development practitioners, we're often seeing the people in the community as beneficiaries, as somehow removed from the work. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, the way we write our proposals, we don't often see them as active participants. And I think a couple of many other speakers have talked about this and the fact that we need to make a shift in how we do our work, not just the engagement around what the problem is, but also how we intend to do the work and how we promote the work. And I think that both Erica and Erica in her presentation about some of the work of EAG mentioned some of the active work that's happening by persons in the community, the innovation and initiative they're taking, and we need to harness this. But I mentioned this particular point because I want to make sure that as we think about our responses and building resilience, we think about planning our activities, we need to remember issues of physical safety and security, particularly for young women and girls. These are issues that can't be ignored. If you wonder sometimes why people are not coming to your meeting, look around. What time are you organizing the meeting? Where are you hosting this meeting? Have you made plans for security and for women to be walking with their small children? And so when you want to be engaged and you want to, you want to consult, these are things that you have to think about. I mentioned here also in terms of physical decision making, the ability to swim. Why do I mention that? Because when I was doing my work on ecosystem-based adaptation last year for the toolkit, one of the things that popped up was how there were differentiated perceptions and roles of how women and men were going to benefit and the types of jobs and even the pay. So for example, when you're doing restoration of environmental ecosystems and structures, often what would happen is that the men would be doing the diving, which was paid at least twice more than the women who were on shore. You're saying that you want to do income smoothing, you say you want to support income and livelihood, but then why are the options not open for both to do these things? And so such a simple thing as the ability to swim, you know, actually can determine what kinds of livelihood opportunities you get, what kinds of pay you get. And so it's important, these things seem simple, but they really are not if you start looking at certain patterns in how we do our work and what kinds of opportunities we're presenting. Finally, on this slide, I just also want to mention the fact that if we're thinking of women and men as environmental decision makers, we need to make sure that we're thinking of simple things like household waste management, you know, not only the drains out in the street, but the drains around the housing. How is the house structured? What are the ways in which they're actually improving that physical resilience, but then also their capacity to invest themselves in resilience. More and more, as you see reports, you realize that with our limited financial space, our limited financial capacity, our limited human resources, even when help is coming, that we often tend to rely almost automatically on communities and people having some element of self-reliance. And so when we do our resilience work, we do need to think about that self-reliance capacity. What are we doing to create this? And what are the tools that they will need to be able to do that? Next slide. And so as we think about this, it's important, you know, some of the things that we recognize from the work around gender were really important in terms of just breaking down some of the elements. When we talk about that self-reliance, part of that is about effective communications and telling and sharing and helping persons themselves to understand what the risks and opportunities are. Part of that is looking at psychosocial support and mechanisms. Crises affect people psychologically. We can't deny that. Even for those who are charged with taking care of others, including your community leaders and your police and your NGO heads, experience crises, experience psychosocial impact. We need to make sure that we're thinking of how that kind of support is provided to those who are expected to support others, including also the household level where parents are going to be supporting children as well. We also need to think about tools and capacities to act. How will that person be able to take action if something happens? And, you know, help is a day away or hours away. Also thinking about health and food security. As I mentioned, if you have particular health or food security requirements, how will those needs be met? What kinds of things can we do, whether it's home gardens, kitchen gardens, or access to certain types of food, or even thinking about the kinds of supplies that come in a post-disaster context. We need to make these connections to persons and to their realities and to their ability to be part of the response and not just waiting for help. Next slide, please.
Sorry, Lisa, we actually have totally out of time. You really need to wrap up. We only have 20 minutes left.
No worries. And so I just want to make the point that in the next slide that we are doing things in the region. There are several things happening, whether it's at the policy level or at the community level, and NGOs are doing some very interesting things. Some governments are doing some very interesting things in terms of looking at the culture of risk. And there are some tools out there that actually are developed not just for national actors, but for local actors. And some of them are mentioned here, and I also put them in the references. I will just go to the last slide, just to make the point that as we think about our resilience, you can skip that one. Keep going. Right, I'll stop here for 2 seconds, just to say that as we transform what we do need to think about not just livelihoods, but ecosystem change, leadership, rights and participation, and governance issues, as well as assets and education. Those are really going to be critical elements to put together in the package. And then on the last slide, I just want to present the fact that when we're thinking about resilience, we need to think about it in a socio-ecological context, and we need to build in some of the very things that others have raised. So it's not just flexibility, it's flexibility and organization and learning and socio-cognitive capacity and agency and having assets. And those assets include culture, and information and knowledge. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. That was a very insightful presentation highlighting the need for gender responsive and inclusive approach. And I think with that, I would like to invite all our panelists to join us for the Q&A. You can turn on their video if you want. I suggest you probably stay on mute until the questions are posed, and you need to speak so we don't have too much echoing. And so apologies to those that we're running a bit late. I'm gonna try and answer as many questions as we have up until maybe 11:50, and then see if we can shorten in the last session on the ALG and do very quick wrap up closing remarks so we still end at 12. And so without sort of much ado, the first question we had posed, which actually I think is for Dr. Greenidge. It's asking, how does SEDIMA see the role of the private sector, particularly tourism and hotel operators, including large hotel chains, in building the resilience of communities whose livelihoods depend on their businesses? What type of regulations are being considered in terms of minimum wage, insurance to provide income to employees, and financial support to small enterprises that are part of the tourism supply chain?
Thank you for the question. So for this one, just very quickly, in view of the time, SEDIMA sees the role of the private sector as being quite essential, it's quite important. And we work with partners who have key roles in the tourism sector. So for example, our key partner for tourism is the Caribbean Tourism Organization. And they have been working quite assiduously to put together a number of programs to support the private sector in building their resilience as it relates to the impacts of shocks. COVID-19 is showing up a number of gaps in this area. And so we have a tourism sector subcommittee that looks at the overall picture of building resilience within that sector. But I do know that SEDIMA also works with CTO on its Sustainable Tourism Committee as they seek to roll out specific interventions for the sector. And also there's some work that we have coming on stream that will be looking at establishing a think tank to develop and implement a plan of action for the rollout of the most feasible and innovative options to address impacts on livelihoods, to include ICTs and private sector engagement. And private sector, it will also have an essential role under Pillar 4 of the Caribbean Pathway to Resilience, which looks at environmental protection incentives there, as well as under the economic side. So very important, and we are advancing work through collaborations with partners that have they are the leaders in those specific areas. So with the CDB, for example, on the financial side, and CTO on the tourism specific side, and then other work that we're doing on building out the incentives. Thank you. I hope I answered the question, and certainly if there's a follow-up to that, you can just put it in the chat and I can try to answer that whilst the other panelists take their questions over.
Okay, thanks, Nicole. I don't know if anybody else wants to add to that. If not, we do have a couple other questions here. One looks to be about empowering communities and really thinking about the long-term sustainability of interventions. So a participant asks, from your experience, are there some interventions that communities are able to continue with reduced assistance? And what are some of the key factors that you find have worked to really ensure that interventions continue beyond the life of a project or initiative? So I'll let you guys, whoever wants to take that question, feel free to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Josette.
Okay, so some of the interventions that we found that can move on without extra financing are like mangrove restoration, also soft riverbank stabilization, because there's hard measures and there's soft measures for riverbank stabilization. For example, we have a riverbank stabilization project which is ongoing in Maguetut, one of our communities in St. Lucia. That was funded by CRIF. And you find that the persons who are working, the persons within the community are able to continue this because we added a livelihood component to it. So you find that fruit trees, fruit plants are used on the riverbank instead of other trees. So when the fruits, when you have harvest, persons can sell it. So they use this as a form of their livelihood, because this particular area is a very, it's a poor community, and so persons use the fruits, they sell it by the road, and we find that they're happy with this. So we do not have to put in any extra funding. They just go on, they clean up, they you know, they work like it's their farm, like it's a farm, but it's government-owned land. So they're able to continue with this without any other support from CRIF. Also for the mangrove restoration in Ancillary, we had this project, and the community, they could continue to clean it because it's to their benefit. Because if they do not, you'll find with heavy rains, the community would flood. So they would continue with that intervention without any other form of support from the funding agency.
Thanks, Josette. Does anybody else want to add to that?
So I wanted to just add that I think when communities are themselves extremely organized, and I think in the Red Cross we found so, and one of our tools that we promote would be the community disaster response teams. And I heard Glenroy speak about the need for community groups, and where that works is that when a community is organized, and when you have these disaster response teams, or community response teams, or in terms of the national disaster organizations, community emergency response teams, when you have these communities organized in terms of when a disaster strikes, and we realize we came across this in Dominica, actually, in Hurricane Maria, that because certain communities were totally locked out or locked off in the first 3 days, for 72 hours of after Maria's impact, the communities with these CDRTs were actually able to have internal and internal responses, and they were able to organize themselves while they were waited for aid. And so I think having appropriate community organization, where the community can, where the community is strong enough to take charge of response and take charge of its own development, I think that's where you get you get a level of sustainability. So regardless of what happens or what the community does or what the community is engaged in, you get that response, or that as I said, the sustainability of the community. So communities that are organized, and that's something that we in the Red Cross movement have been pushing. Yeah, so that would be my take on it, at least one aspect.
I wanted to add something before you continue. I also wanted to say that if community groups are engaged from the conceptualization of a project, they would continue working with that, even if the project, the lifespan of the project has, gone, and they would continue because they felt that they were involved from the inception, and they would find the need to continue to move forward with the project without any sort of financing.
I just also wanted to add to what Josette has said, to say, and also the other colleague, to say that I think organization is key, but also social capital. not all communities function very well or function very well together. If you're not aware of the conflicts that are going on in the community, projects can very easily fall apart. And so having strong social capital and having, conflict-sensitive mechanisms are important. So is leadership. And by leadership, I don't mean just one person, so that if that person leaves the community, everything falls apart. But having really strong leadership across the community is important. Last quick point, if the project responds to multiple things the community needs, as Josette has described, not just one thing, but multiple things. So you pick up on multiple things, it's much easier for that community to stick with the project because they will see the continuation of those benefits coming to them, whether there's a disaster or not.
Thanks. I think you guys very comprehensively responded to that question. And there was a lot of food for thought there. We have another question, which is a bit different. I think it's thinking about the idea of a multi-hazard approach and how we really do that in practice. So for example, we currently in the hurricane season, and we have Tropical Storm Gonzalo, which is about to hit on Saturday. We also have COVID-19, and as Dr. McConney from UE SUMIS is pointing out, we also have these mass sargassum influxes and strandings happening right now. And how do you think about addressing those various myriad kinds of risks? And particularly, how do you factor in sargassum and other things in thinking about local disaster resilience?
Okay, I guess I'll try to jump in on this one. I think that we first look at, some of the experiences that we've had over the last several years. And we need to learn from those, where we've done well and where we've not done well. I see multi-hazard challenges as, in different ways. I think one is the issue of cascading effects. So a disaster may then create other mini crises and disasters. There is also the issue of things happening at the same time that are disconnected. So we have COVID-19 and now we have the hurricane season in the Caribbean, and we have to think about how to grapple with both, including if something happens and we don't have access to water, that potentially puts a lot of COVID response mechanisms and measures into some serious challenges. And then you can also have multiple different things happening at the economic, social, and environmental area at the same time. And so I think we need to look at some of the experiences we've had where, Dominica has multiple, events that are extensive and intensive. And that also happened in Grenada. We also need to look at some of the lessons we should have learned. I don't know that we've learned them from the financial crisis. And we need to also look at some of the lessons that we're learning in this particular context, and with sargassum happening on the side. Now, I think the challenge sometimes with some of the hazards is that not everybody is facing the same from the hazards. So yes, I, Lucia, will know that sargassum is the issue, but it's not impinging on my life in a serious way. Meanwhile, for somebody else, it's a very serious issue, whether it's because of where they live or because of their reliance on fisheries or tourism. And so I think that taking a people-centered approach and looking at where and how these hazards are affecting the lives of people is an important place to start in terms of understanding why it is not just a hazard, but it's creating a crisis that requires urgent action, and then to think about what kinds of actions we need to take. I think there are several conceptual frameworks out there in terms of how to deal with multi-hazards, but I think often what we're missing is people and understanding what's driving people's exposure and susceptibility to some of these hazards, and why for some people it's intense and extensive, and why for other persons it's situational but not a crisis as yet. And I think those are some of the ways that we need to start looking at these issues.
Can I jump in on this one as well? Hi. Okay, thank you. I just want to share quickly. This is a piece of research that I would have worked on as part of my PhD. Lisa talks about different conceptual frameworks for how we think about the whole multi-hazard approach and how we make that practical. And one of the things that came out in my research is that as we think about how it all connects. Pre-estimation here, as I'm sharing up on the screen, that is where you have a science as to what could possibly create a challenge. You know, who's looking out for the COVID-19s, who's looking out for the seismic threats, the, you know, the hydromet threats and so on, what could potentially be highly devastating. And then you have that assessment of your capacity to deal with that from an adaptive perspective, because this is looking at all the threats, including those climate change related extremes. And then it needs to be interdisciplinary in terms of how we understand the risk, in terms of the vulnerability, in terms of the exposure. All of that needs to come together. You need your scientists, you need your physical ones, you need your social scientists, you need them all in one space somehow. And then there's that characterization of what that is in terms of how devastating it could be, what are the social concerns and so on that might make it lesser, or that may, you know, make it amplified, the risk that you may be facing, and then what can be done to manage and then monitor and control. And all of this needs to happen within a context where there's that communication happening, where there's deliberation, because it's not simply that, you know, you can just do a model of flooding and say, well, this is what we expect this flooding to be. But within the context that we are operating in today, there are things that are happening beyond, you know, what we may have known from the past. And so deliberation is very important in terms of how people understand the uncertainty and how they deal with that, and then the involvement of all of the different actions. And at the core of this framework is systems. We are all interrelated, and it's all intersected. Our food systems, our economic systems, our, you know, when we look at the livelihoods and so on. So it's quite interconnected. And so that needs to be at the core, the environmental systems. So this is a way of how we think about it. And one of the things that I would have put forward in that research is that we need to have kind of like joined up approaches in terms of the interfaces between the NGOs, the interfaces between the government. We can't work in the silos, and we need to have some kind of deliberative platform for where these issues are discussed and how we understand the risks that we face within the multi-hazard context. So I just wanted to put those ideas out there for consideration. And at the moment, I don't think we have this really functioning in our region. There are some attempts, for example, the CIMH from a hydromet side is trying to think about, you know, bringing together the different actors for drought, for meteorological hazards, but we need more multi-hazard platforms that will function, yes, regionally, but then at the national level, that will involve and include everyone. Thank you. Over.
Thanks, Nicole. That was very, I think, useful kind of way to connect the dots in terms of thinking about that issue. As we're really kind of running out of time, and so the last question I wanted to pose to the panelists, because we don't really have time to ask too many more, was there were a number of comments that people made throughout their presentations in relation to finance, access to financing, ensuring that funding is more flexible. And I would probably add that ensuring that we're able to mobilize it and channel it down to the grassroots and on the ground, so it's actually reaching and helping the most vulnerable and at-risk groups and communities. And so I wanted to ask you all, and how do you think we can better mobilize resources and funding to really get this work done and to empower communities? Because even as Josette said, a lot of times you can take on interventions without much support. You do still need some funding and assistance to really do that work and really scale up and have impact. I don't know if Nicole or any of the other panelists wants to take that question in terms of, you know, ensuring access to.
Yeah. So I think that's a very good question, Ayinka. So again, at the Red Cross, one of the things that we look at is our approach has been in the past, of course, to facilitate our community engagement through projects, and we've recognized that project approach is not sustainable. because when the financing from the project is completed or has finished, then sometimes the project just falls apart, because and then there are other factors, and Lisa and Josette mentioned most of them. And so I think I want to link it with the community's understanding of what their risks and their vulnerabilities are. So to ensure that they have a very clear idea of what their risks are, what their vulnerabilities are, and not necessarily, and I take Lisa's was it Lisa's point? Yes, Lisa, in terms of you indicating that the communities cannot only be geographic. And that's something that we've realized because we deal, as I said, with migrant communities. And during COVID-19, we're doing a series of recovery assessments throughout the region from the constituents of the Red Cross. And what we realized, of course, is that communities also involved and the communities that have been hit are not necessarily geographical, but we're talking about the we're talking about the hoteliers, the taxi drivers, and so on. So the idea then is that if communities, either geographical or not, understand what they're facing, then they can themselves look at what capacities they have and what initiatives that they themselves can put in place to generate finance. And the other thing is that to ensure, and I've heard it been said throughout this morning, that the communities are themselves not isolated. So as I talked about earlier on, connecting and supporting communities that we work with to connect with new possibilities, with new partnerships, non-traditional partnerships, in order to generate that finance. And then in terms of the Red Cross, we also have where we are looking at a tool, forecast-based financing, in terms of looking at, specifically for disaster response, looking at what these forecasts are and generating finance prior to an emergency. And therefore that's something that it's fairly new in the region, and we were trying to promote it. And Nicole mentioned the CIMH. So because we recognize that we are faced, we say dual disasters, but multiple things happening at the same time. The idea of understanding what's happening, we've been working with our climate center, and we've been working with CIMH to produce guidelines for dual disasters, and based on forecasting, so that what national societies can help their communities understand that this is what they're going to be faced with, and this is what is going to be predicted, this is what's being predicted, and to generate finance from that. So I'll stop here to let my colleagues
A quick point to add to that is that there are some efforts already ongoing in the region to do this kind of thing. It's important to also know that not every activity needs a whole lot of money. One of the things that we discovered when we were doing our EBA work for the OECS Commission and the region is some interesting work in Caracou, for example, by the Kido Foundation, that costs like maybe 10,000 to 30,000 EC a year. They've been able to consistently get funding. But what they've also done that's very interesting is that they've tied the ecosystem-based work on mangrove restoration to conservation of turtles to also economic empowerment activities. So they themselves are thinking long-term and thinking about that. So they've looked at the issue of waste, for example, and plastic waste, which is a problem for the conservation work that they want to do. It's an opportunity to engage women in the community to make bags that people are buying, and they've got customers in Caracou and also in Grenada. And so they've already started to think through this issue of access to finance, the type of finance, and how that money also can be multiplied and circulated. And so that's also the issue. It's not necessarily a linear process finance. It also can be a circular process. And if you're doing your project design well, you can actually do a lot with a little bit of money. And so I think we also need to be creative in terms of how we think about financing and how we do our investment to make sure that that money multiplies in the community and create those long-term benefits. And then also banks in St. Lucia and Grenada are taking on the issue of climate. They're providing loans and concessional loans and access to different forms of finance that could help persons in sectors and persons with specific livelihood needs to respond to some of these challenges and to build their resilience in that way. And so I think there are ways to look at how that finance is working, how it can be improved and made more accessible, and used more, because sometimes when you look at the reports, a lot of the money is not moving. But I don't know if that's a communication issue, if it's a requirement issue, but we also need to look at what's already there and how we can make it more accessible to those who need it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Lisa.
10 seconds, 10 seconds
Okay.
from me. I just wanted to say that CRIF have a year-round small grants program. Gina was on and she mentioned it. She made some comments in the Q&A. So it's available, and also the New Zealand High Commission office in Barbados, they provide small grants, 15,000 US. So they have small grants, people just have to search, but it's there, and it's not so, it's not so stringent that they have so many tough questions like EU and World Bank, so they can access those funds.
Okay, great. So I think with that, I'm going to have to end our panel discussion, which was very short but sweet. And I'll hand over to my colleague Candice to do her final session on launching our action learning group to take on some of these issues and to continue kind of teasing out what needs to be done to really empower and support communities across the Caribbean in building disaster resilience.
Okay, let me. Okay, so thank you very much, Anka. I'm not going to put up any presentation. I actually just had one slide. And this is really to acknowledge that there's still a lot of conversations to be had about local resilience, especially, using the community-based approaches and ecosystem-based approaches to reducing risk and building resilience. And so one of the things that we'll be doing under this project is actually, that is the CSOs for Disaster Resilience Project, is convening an action learning group. And so we did mention it's the Community Resilience Action Learning Group. And the idea is that, we want to ensure that there is opportunity or mechanisms for capacity building and further learning and dialogue on these topics. And this is a way where we will be supporting the civil society organizations that we will be working with under the project to build their capacity to share knowledge, experiences, and so on. And also, as they form the core of what we call this action learning group, we will be engaging others. So the local government bodies, National Red Cross societies, and others who may be interested and available to input and help with that learning process. And just to say that action learning is really a process that involves working on real challenges, using knowledge and skills of a small group of people, and combining that with questioning skills to reinterpret old and familiar concepts and produce new ideas. And so we will be trying to take challenges that are actually happening through the implementation of the project and working through those with the CSOs that are participating and others. So I'll just end by saying that we are in the process of convening the members, and we'll be holding our inception meeting soon, and we'll be keeping others informed. So stay tuned for what will be happening with the Action Learning Group, as well as with the wider CSOs for Disaster Resilience Project. And with that, I will hand you now back to my director, Nicole, for some final closing remarks.
Thank you, Candice, and thank you everyone for bearing with us. I know we went a few minutes late, but we cannot rush off without thanking you for your great interaction and the questions. Very much the excellent panelists, including my colleagues at CANARI, Ainka and Candice. Thank you. And then all of our expert panelists from SEDIMA, OECS Commission, I'm going to forget people. Thank you very much for what you've shared. I wish we had more time to talk, But I do want to remind people, we had a couple of questions. Canary will pull together the presentations and the discussion and produce a report and share it. So you have registered, you will certainly get this. Very special thanks to the Inter-American Foundation, of course, for your support, and Canary's partner, CSO, is with us on the project, which is led by Candice. So she is the lady you need to follow up with if you are so passionate and interested in finding out more. And I just wanted to leave you with a question to reflect on. I think really this morning we heard the passion, the energy, the real experience on the ground of needing to prioritize work on community-based and nature-based adaptation. So we're really building resilience on the ground. And I wanted to ask, to you to reflect on, to what extent do you feel Caribbean governments and Caribbean people are putting a climate resilient approach as at the heart of their COVID-19 recovery planning? That is certainly going to be shaping economic development trajectories in the near to medium future, and to what extent is the importance of building this kind of climate and disaster resilience being incorporated into COVID-19 thinking, and to what extent are local community-based and nature-based approaches being thought about there? So that's something really homework for you, and Canary is going to continue to talk about this. And we want to wish all of you all of the best as you continue to build your own resilience, being proactive, strengthening your capacity as we deal with COVID-19, sargassum, hurricane season, all the other risks we're facing. And I'll close with Nicole from SEDIMA's thoughts that, let us bounce forward together in one. So thank you very much, everyone. From Canary, have a great day, and please keep in touch with us. Thank you.